My name is Fernando Jones. I grew up at 55 East 60th Street, which is right between Michigan and Wabash. In my area, Teresa's Lounge was right up the street on Indiana, 4801 South Indiana. I come from a musical family. My eldest brother, Forey Superstar, and Greg Jones were my two musical heroes. And as a kid, in an African American family on the south side of Chicago, when you have older brothers and sisters, in addition to your parents, they are like your junior parents. So wherever they go, you go. So my brother Forey was in the class and contemporary of Buddy Guy and Junior Wells. And so when he would go to the checkerboard later in the 70s, but Teresa's late 60s, early 70s, I would go also. My brother Forey was one of the last stand-up blues singers. You know, a lot of guys in Chicago are singers that play a lot of guitar, sing a little bit and play a lot of guitar. And in fact, Buddy Guy had some vocal issues at some point in time in his career. My brother sang for him. And so I grew up seeing that. I grew up in an environment where music was everywhere. On 60th Street, which is pretty much just 50 blocks south of where we are right now, music was everywhere. And I always say in my neighborhood, we had everything. We had athletes, we had gangsters, and we had musicians. And some people were skilled enough to be in all three. So I grew up and I saw that life and I heard it. You know, a typical day in the summer, for example, me and my little buddies, the Campbells, which I called my play cousins, we would play sports all day. And just as the sun would go down, the bigger boys, like my brother Greg, who was about 8 years older than me, Ike Campbell, Ernest Dawkins, and all those guys are from my neighborhood. And they were like my big brothers because they were my brother Greg's friends, so they were my friends or big brothers as well, I guess. And they would play. And they would play right in our backyard, which was a neighborhood that was a result of white flight. You know, after 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, a lot of buildings were burned, and some landlords probably even burned their own buildings to get the insurance money and moved to the suburbs, and they left this area, and then blacks migrated from Mississippi and the whole bit, and inhabited these apartments that had marble staircases. And you know, and I know that marble staircases were probably not put into buildings for people of African descent migrating from Mississippi to come and walk on. And so the backyard that we had was free of grass. And back in that day, they would drop coal in the backyard, and if the landlord forgot to do it, the tenants, you know, you shovel it down into the basement so that you would have heat. And so years and years of that, we had a barren backyard that had, you know, broken pop bottles in the backyard, rocks, pieces of coal, and we would play back there. And no one ever got cut or harmed. And then once again, it would transform from an athletic stadium to Woodstock. As the sun would go down, my brother would be playing in his band, and these would be bands that would be, if there were 3 drummers in the neighborhood, 3 drummers would bring 3 drum kits. And my brother Greg was a multi-instrumentalist, and he played the Hammond B3 and the Wurlitzer organ, and he also had a portable electric keyboard. So putting this in a historical perspective, you're looking at between 1968, when I started playing at 4 years old, and about 1972, 1973. 1970, 71, around the time when Jimi Hendrix passed away, it was kind of like a death on the electric guitar as being the popular focal instrument. And after that, the focal point was, in the progressive rock bands, was the keyboard, and was the electric keyboard and the portable keyboard. And my brother Greg was on the vanguard of that on the south side of Chicago that had that, because my parents had resources where he was able to have a real nice Wurlitzer keyboard that I still have today, that you're looking in the late 1960s, that a black kid had a real piece of furniture as well as a portable keyboards and access to a Hammond B3 at the church, which is called Everybody's Church, which is still standing right at the corner of 60th and Wabash. So that's the area that I grew up in. I grew up during a time where people of color, particularly black folk or African Americans, were proud to be black folks. You know, it was the Vietnam War was going on and kind of coming to an end. You know, James Brown had said loud, "I'm black and I'm proud." Black folk were changing their names to more African sounding names. And we had those folk in the neighborhood also. We even had black Muslims in the neighborhood. So in this neighborhood, music was the central focus of all of those different subculture groups within a larger culture group of black folks who migrated from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, so on and so forth. On any given day when the weather was nice, not only would there be a concert with my brother and his band in our backyard, across the street, which would be in the 5900 block between Wabash and Michigan, there would be bands playing, and the guys would go from yard to yard, back and forth from yard to yard, and keep the music playing. When you walk down the street, it was like a soundtrack. Music was always happening. When I was 4 years old, my brother Greg told me not to bother his equipment. And this equipment consisted of, like I said before, the keyboards that he had, Fender guitars, Fender basses, as well as the accoutrements of his other friends that would leave stuff in our house after they rehearsed, because they never called it a practice, they would call it a rehearsal. And I thought that that was so cool because it sounded official. From the moment that I saw my brothers playing and saw the beauty of the instruments and the femininity of a guitar, being a mannish little boy, I knew I wanted to do it right then and there. And blues had always been there, so it was nothing like I wanted to, you know, like a lot of my contemporaries, when they're 16 years old, they see a commercial or something and they go and buy a guitar and they want to do it. It was always there. And I realized just within the last couple of years that I was in love with my brothers. They were so cool. Everything they did was cool. When they smoked a cigarette, it looked cool. The cars that they drove looked cool. The girls that they were around looked cool. And it was like the physics of sound, of plugging a guitar into an amplifier here and striking it and it comes out over there, it fascinated me. So I was always in love with music. And I don't know if there was ever a particular moment that it was like, okay, I'm going to do this, because music had always been there. Even when I went to college and graduated, I found a way to incorporate music, definitely a focus on the blues, with doing blues concerts at the University of Illinois at Chicago, because my older brother was a blues singer. I graduated from UIC. I come out of the Department of Architecture and Art. And I did like so many kids, you know, the first year when you get out of college, you try to figure out what you want to do, and you're scared because it lets you know that you're not a cute little kid anymore, you know, because as long as you're in college and you're in your family, it's as if you're the only person to ever go to college. And as long as you're wearing your college University of Illinois sweatshirt around, everybody thinks that it is cute and it's adorable and everything you do bad is forgiven because you're a college student and the whole bit. But the day after you graduate, you become officially a man. And it's like, oh wow, I want to be a kid forever. I want to play my guitar. So what I did, I still practice my skill as a graphic artist and, you know, advertising type person and the whole bit. Then an aunt of mine said, well, Fernando, you know, you're good with kids and stuff and you're always tinkering with something, why don't you try to teach? And I said, I don't want to teach, blah, blah, blah. So she said, go down to the board. So I went down to the board and I became a substitute teacher. I have an undergraduate degree and I had to take a test. And I'm a bad man, Paul. And then after that, then I started taking education classes and so on and so forth. And then you just grow and you just grow and you evolve. I had my guitar in class one day around 1989, 1990, and I finished my lesson a little bit early. And I just started playing and singing songs to the kids, and that was the birth of my Blues Kids of America program. So 25 years later, it's 25 years old, and we also have a blues camp that has come from that. these were the days of $50 a man. I had a power trio that consisted of a gentleman named Andre Cotton on drums, which was phenomenal. And he was probably, those guys may be like about 10 or 11 years older than me. So I was a baby, and they were men with beards and had women that were 10 or 20 years older than them. So, and my nephew Chip, who was a year under me, who was still with me. And, but remember, I started off as a guitar player, and I would write songs, but I didn't really care about singing. I just wanted to play, like so many of us as guitar players. But my brother was such a magnificent singer, and he was a man's man type person. So I knew if I got a gig, and if I can get him to sing, I could keep the gig. You know, because average guitar players, until you reach a maturity, you just want to play all the time, and you want to solo all the time. You don't realize that chords are important, and you don't realize that you don't have to solo on every song, and you don't realize that you don't even have to play guitar on every song in order to make it an effective song. So that's what we did. And then my brother, being the quintessential big brother, he's probably about 22 or 23 years older than I was. You know, so if I was 20, he was 42. So he was a man, and he has a daughter that is my age. So that gives you a perspective of that dynamic. And we, at some points, had like a sibling rivalry type thing, because I just wanted my brother's approval. But he was so hard on me because he wanted me to be the best, because he felt that I was represent him. And he was the type of guy that would rarely say anything nice to me, but he would always say great things to Buddy and to Junior and all those guys, because I was his little brother and they knew me and all this kind of stuff. And then when we would play on stage, I would always be, you know, in the back of my mind, I was like, man, I hope I'm doing well for my brother. And then somewhere in the set, he'd say, "Mama's baby boy." And when he said that, I knew that everything was cool. And then after the show, that it was like, you know, nothing was good enough and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I gigged around. And then you just evolve as a human being, and you evolve as a player. Coming back to the voice, I didn't have a voice that could mimic other people. And I had so much respect for all the people that the other people were mimicking. I didn't ever want to be in a situation where I'd performed an Albert King song and I had to go to the bathroom, and he came into the bathroom and said, "You messed my song up." So a light bulb went on and said, "Well, Fernando, you can be the best you that you can be." So I started writing even more songs and started putting my songs in the show. And then my brother started doing less and less, and then I built my confidence. And so X amount of years later, good or bad, I'm wherever I am in life on my own, you know, doing my own songs and just being my own person. I think that it is intellectually disingenuous when blues musicians say that young blacks don't play the blues anymore, because they do. And when they do play and when they do show up, sometimes we are so dismissive of them till you run them away with the rhetoric of they don't exist. Because I was one of them, and I couldn't be the only one of them. And a number of my contemporaries, a handful of us who are sons or daughters of blues people, were singing the blues in their households, not because it was the blues, but because it was something that was familiar with us, to us, and it was ours. It was in the household. Through my blues camp, I see tons of African Americans as well as kids from other ethnic groups and other socioeconomic backgrounds that love playing the blues, and they're not playing it because it's popular. They're really playing it because they have to. And when they have to play it, it's something that has touched their soul. And whether there was a blues industry or not, they would still play. What has caused the blues to be at the state that it is now is the lack of originality of blues sound recordings. You know, we all know about the 12-bar blues form, and that's fantastic, but it is a shame that a song that was made in 1950, that it is still part of the repertoire of 98% of the guys that are still playing. And I'm a songwriter, and I love when people do my songs, but after a while there should be a moratorium called on certain things. And I think that we insult and we have insulted the listeners. I have friends that record albums, and they're wonderful albums, and you go see them play, and they don't play anything off the album. They play the same set list that they played 10 years ago or 30 years ago. And you say, well, why are you doing that? And they say, well, my audience wants to hear something that is familiar. No, an audience wants to hear something that is engaging. you know, and it's not that I'm so much better than anybody else. Everywhere that I've been all over the world, I have gone as Fernando Jones, the guy who wrote the song. I didn't go as the cover king guy. I became known as the guy educating kids with the blues comes back to when I was a substitute teacher in the Chicago public school system. And one day brought my guitar to class and just started playing for the kids. And I even wrote a couple songs, you know, I guess like While on the Clock at CPS, you know, I Want to Spend Christmas with You was one of my more successful tunes that I wrote one of the hottest days of the school year right over here at South Loop School. You look at a certain kid and you see a piece of yourself in them, you know. And with me, it was a little girl, Vanchuk was her last name, up in Idlewild, Michigan. I was playing up there, and her mother and father brought her up there. Same story you hear every time you go do a show. This is my kid. They play. They're really good. Give them a chance. And I saw a little girl. I looked in her eyes. She might have been about in 7th grade or so at the time. It's around 2008, 2009. And when I looked in her eyes, I can see that this was, if I turned her down, she would have still kept going, but it would have been a big crushing blow. So I let her sit in and play, and of course, you know, that helped her esteem. And so as I got to know them, I found out that because she liked the blues, she was being bullied. You know, and this is before this whole big famous bully campaign had come to town. Then when she went to high school, she had to be in the jazz band because she loved music, but there was no blues component. And then she was voted like the #1 guitarist in high school in the state of Michigan. And so then she went to the University of Michigan, or Michigan University, Maize and Blue, or whatever the correct term of it is. And to say that that little girl helped spark me to do the blues camp is really more about her and kids like her than myself. I just happened to be in a position where I was crazy enough to say, okay, if I do this, I'll build it, kids will come.